People keep asking the same question over and over, and it deserves an honest answer. Were there really offers to rebuild the Whitakers' home, or was that just something people said after everything fell apart? The truth is, the offers were real. They weren't vague promises or empty comments tossed into a live stream. They were specific, practical, and in some cases professionally backed. People with real experience, real resources, and real willingness stepped forward and said, "We can help." Some of these offers came from people who had spent decades in construction, roofing, electrical work, and supply distribution. They weren't chasing clout. They weren't asking for exposure. They didn't want to film content or turn the family into a spectacle. They saw a broken house, a vulnerable family, and an opportunity to actually fix something. Windows, doors, siding, framing materials, even labor were put on the table. In several cases, the only thing they asked for was coordination. A phone call, an email, a green light to move forward. And yet, nothing happened. That's where the story starts to get uncomfortable. Because the narrative pushed later was that help was impossible, that nothing could be done, that the situation was too complicated or too far gone. But that narrative doesn't line up with the timeline. When these offers were coming in, the family was still together. The house was still standing. The crisis hadn't reached the point of state intervention yet. This was the window where action could have changed everything. Instead of coordination, there was silence. People left comments offering help and watched them get buried. Some were pinned briefly, then disappeared. Others were acknowledged vaguely, only to be followed by statements suggesting that outside help was no longer needed. Suddenly, there were claims that a different plan was already in motion. A better plan, a quieter plan, a plan that didn't require volunteers or outside contractors. And once that idea took hold, the offer stopped being welcomed. What's strange is how fast the tone shifted. At first, rebuilding was the goal. Fixing the house was the talking point. Donations were justified by the promise of improvement. But when real builders showed up, when people said they could donate materials or time, the focus drifted. The house became less important. The conversation turned toward control, management, and authority. Fixing the physical space was no longer the priority. That raises a hard question. If rebuilding the home was truly the goal, why ignore the people who could make it happen? Some say it was chaos. Too many messages, too much noise, too many voices all at once. That explanation only goes so far, because ignoring one or two messages is understandable. Ignoring dozens, especially when they're consistent and credible, is something else entirely. At a certain point, inaction becomes a decision. Others believe the offers didn't fit a particular narrative. A rebuilt home changes the story. It removes urgency. It removes the justification for drastic measures. A safe, repaired house makes it harder to argue that separation was inevitable. And once the narrative shifts toward danger and unlivable conditions, accepting help to fix those conditions undermines the entire argument. That's where things get darker. Because if the house had been repaired, if visible progress had been made, then questions would have followed. Where did the money go? Why did it take so long? Why were donations collected if free labor and materials were available? Rebuilding would have brought transparency. And transparency is uncomfortable when stories don't align. People who offered help weren't just offering hammers and lumber. They were offering accountability. They were offering proof that something real was happening. And for reasons no one has fully explained, that kind of proof was never allowed to exist. After the family was split, the silence became even louder. You would think that once everything fell apart, once the house was empty and the family scattered, those offers would finally be accepted. That someone would reach back out and say, "Are you still willing?" But that never happened either. Not a single coordinated effort to revisit those offers. Not one public attempt to say, let's fix what we can. Instead, the story moved on. The family lost their home. Betty lost decades of memories. The public was told it was tragic but unavoidable. And the people who had raised their hands early on were left asking themselves the same question everyone else is asking now. Why were we ignored? This isn't about blaming one person or turning everything into a villain story. It's about recognizing a pattern. Help was available, help was offered, and help was declined quietly and consistently. That choice changed the outcome of everything that followed. If even one of those offers had been accepted, the timeline might look very different today. Repairs might have started. Inspections might have gone another way. The argument that nothing could be done wouldn't hold up. And that's the part no one seems willing to address directly. So now the responsibility falls on the audience, the community that watched this unfold in real time. Not to rewrite history, but to question it honestly. Because the truth is rarely hidden. Most of the time, it's just ignored until it's too late. If offers to rebuild were real, and they were ignored, then the next question is unavoidable. Who benefited from saying no? Comment below and share what you think really happened. As people began digging deeper, another layer of the story came into focus, and it made the unanswered questions even harder to ignore. This wasn't just about missed opportunities or poor communication. It was about a pattern of control that slowly revealed itself once you stepped back and looked at the full timeline. When the offers to rebuild first surfaced, they didn't come all at once. They trickled in steadily. A comment here, an email there, a message passed through someone who knew someone. What matters is that these offers didn't originate from one circle or one platform. They came from different states, different backgrounds, different levels of involvement. And yet the response was always the same. Nothing. No follow-up, no coordination, no acknowledgement beyond vague statements that something else was already being handled. That alone might not seem alarming, but then people started noticing something else. Whenever someone publicly asked why volunteers weren't being contacted, the conversation would abruptly shift. The topic would move away from rebuilding and toward urgency. Safety, liability, risk. Suddenly, the house wasn't something that could be repaired. It was something that had to be escaped. This shift didn't happen by accident. The idea of rebuilding requires patience. It requires collaboration. It requires allowing other people into the process. And most importantly, it requires transparency. Once builders are on site, once materials start showing up, once work begins, everything becomes visible. Progress can be measured. Money can be tracked. Promises can be verified. Urgency, on the other hand, shuts all of that down. When a situation is framed as an emergency, questioning decisions becomes inappropriate. Asking for receipts sounds cruel. Suggesting alternative solutions sounds reckless. And anyone who slows the process becomes part of the problem. Urgency silences scrutiny. And that's exactly what happened. People who pushed for rebuilding were gradually reframed as distractions. Some were accused of not understanding the situation. Others were painted as outsiders who didn't know what was best for the family. A few were quietly blocked or ignored altogether. The message was clear. The window for rebuilding had closed, even though no visible attempt had ever been made. That's when the narrative hardened. The house was described as beyond saving. The conditions were labeled unfixable. The risks were exaggerated until the idea of repair sounded irresponsible. But here's the part that still doesn't sit right with many people. If the house was truly that dangerous, why was it acceptable for the family to live there for years while donations were being collected? Why did it only become unlivable when questions about money and progress started piling up? That contradiction is impossible to ignore. Those who offered help didn't just disappear. Many stayed quiet out of respect. Others assumed their help simply wasn't needed anymore. But a few kept watching, and what they saw disturbed them. Instead of rebuilding efforts, they saw trips, purchases, side projects, anything but tangible improvements to the home. That's when frustration turned into suspicion. People began comparing timelines. When offers came in, when they were ignored, when the tone shifted, when urgency suddenly took over, when state involvement entered the picture. And when you line it all up, a troubling possibility emerges. Accepting help would have delayed everything that came next. It would have complicated decisions that were already being made behind the scenes. Rebuilding the house would have anchored the family in place. And that mattered. Once the house was framed as unsalvageable, removal became easier to justify. Once removal happened, responsibility shifted. Once responsibility shifted, accountability vanished. The problem was no longer about promises or donations. It became about procedures, agencies, and systems. And those systems don't answer questions the way individuals do. That's not an accident. That's strategy. Another detail people often overlook is how rebuilding offers threaten the role of the middleman. Volunteers don't need managers. Builders don't need storytellers. Materials don't need narratives. Once real work begins, the spotlight moves away from the person speaking and onto the work itself. And for someone whose influence depends on being the central figure, that's a risk. If the house had been rebuilt by volunteers, who would get credit? Who would control the process? Who would decide what was shown and what wasn't? Those questions matter more than most people realize. As time went on, the silence around the ignored offers became louder. People began sharing screenshots, messages, comments that had been pinned, then removed, conversations where help was acknowledged privately but never acted on publicly. Piece by piece, a picture formed, not of chaos, but of deliberate avoidance. And then came the aftermath. After the family was split and the house was effectively abandoned, the idea of rebuilding quietly vanished from the conversation altogether. No calls for volunteers. No fundraising campaigns for repairs. No reassessment of earlier offers. Just acceptance. The loss was framed as final. Inevitable. Unavoidable. But inevitability only exists when options are removed. The hardest part for many people watching wasn't just that the house wasn't rebuilt. It was realizing that it didn't have to end this way. That help was real. That solutions existed. And that the outcome might have been very different if even one of those offers had been taken seriously. This isn't about romanticizing volunteers or pretending rebuilding would have been easy. It would have been messy. It would have taken time. It would have required trust. And that's exactly why it mattered. Because trust is the one thing that never seemed to be on the table. Instead, decisions were made in isolation. Narratives were shaped carefully. And when everything finally collapsed, the explanation was already prepared. There was nothing we could do. But the record tells a different story. There are things that could have been done. People who were willing to do them. And chances that were quietly passed over. Now, looking back, the question isn't whether the offers were real. That's no longer in doubt. The question is why they were ignored and who benefited from that silence. Comment below and share your thoughts. As the dust settled and people began replaying everything in their minds, the focus shifted from what didn't happen to who made sure it didn't happen. Because by this point, it was no longer believable that the offers to rebuild were simply overlooked. Too many people had spoken up. Too many messages had been sent. Too many opportunities had been placed directly in front of the same small group of decision makers. What emerged instead was a pattern of gatekeeping. Anyone who wanted to help had to go through one channel, one voice, one narrative. There was no public list of volunteers. No transparent plan. No open coordination. Everything filtered through a single point of control. And when you centralize control like that, you also centralize power. That's where things started to feel uncomfortable for a lot of observers. Because the Whitakers weren't the ones declining help. They weren't fielding emails. They weren't evaluating construction plans or material donations. Those decisions were being made for them, often without their visible involvement at all. When asked directly, family members gave vague answers. They repeated phrases they'd heard before. It's being handled. Something's already in place. We're waiting on the right solution. But no solution ever arrived. And that raised another critical question. If rebuilding was never the goal, then what was? The answer begins to take shape when you look at how the story was framed over time. Early on, the narrative focused on hope, fixing things, improving conditions, giving the family a better life. But as scrutiny increased, hope quietly disappeared. In its place came fear, risk, liability, words that shut down debate instead of opening it. Once fear takes over, people stop asking practical questions. They stop thinking about alternatives. They accept outcomes they would otherwise resist. And most importantly, they stop looking backward. Fear pushes everything into the present moment, where decisions feel urgent and irreversible. That shift didn't benefit the family. It benefited the people controlling the narrative. Because while the audience was being told that rebuilding wasn't possible, other things were happening off to the side. Money was moving. Relationships were changing. Alliances were forming and breaking. And all of it happened without the transparency that rebuilding would have required. Think about what a rebuild would have meant in practice. Contractors showing up, materials delivered, photos of progress, timelines, receipts. Each of those things creates a paper trail. Each one invites oversight. Each one limits the ability to reshape the story later. Rebuilding locks you into accountability. And accountability is the one thing that never seemed welcome. Instead, what unfolded was a slow retreat from responsibility. When people asked why help wasn't accepted, the answers grew shorter, more defensive. Eventually, those questions stopped being answered at all. Some voices were pushed out of the conversation entirely. That's when the story became less about a house and more about control. Control over who speaks. Control over who helps. Control over what the public sees. And once control becomes the priority, the needs of the family inevitably become secondary. Another uncomfortable truth emerged during this period. Some of the ignored offers came with conditions that weren't actually unreasonable. Builders wanted to know who they were coordinating with. Donors wanted assurance that materials would go toward repairs. Volunteers wanted clarity about timelines and responsibilities. None of that should have been a problem, unless clarity itself was the problem. Because clarity removes ambiguity. And ambiguity is powerful. It allows stories to be rewritten. It allows failures to be reframed. It allows outcomes to be blamed on circumstances instead of choices. By keeping everything vague, the people in charge preserve their ability to pivot, to change direction without explanation, to move from "we're rebuilding" to "we had no choice" without acknowledging the space in between. And that space is where the truth lives. As more time passed, people began asking a harder question. If rebuilding was never seriously considered, were the offers ignored because they conflicted with a different plan? One that didn't involve keeping the family together in that home? That possibility changed everything. Because once removal entered the picture, rebuilding became inconvenient. A repaired home weakens the argument for separation. A functional house undermines claims of immediate danger. A visible improvement complicates the justification for drastic intervention. In that context, ignoring offers wasn't negligence. It was necessity. A rebuilt home would have raised too many questions. Why now? Why not sooner? Where did the money go? Who decided this wasn't possible before? And those are questions no one seemed eager to answer. So instead, the house was allowed to remain exactly as it was. Not improved, not repaired, not stabilized, frozen in time. A static image that could later be used as evidence of failure. That's the part that still haunts many people watching this unfold. The conditions that were eventually used to justify separation were the same conditions that had existed all along. Conditions that could have been addressed. Conditions that people offered to help fix. The tragedy isn't just that the offers were ignored. It's that the consequences of ignoring them were then presented as unavoidable. And once the family was split, the conversation shifted again. Suddenly, rebuilding was no longer relevant. The house was no longer discussed as a place to return to. It became a symbol of the past, a closed chapter, something that couldn't be saved. But that conclusion only makes sense if you erase everything that came before it. The offers, the messages, the volunteers, the chances to do something different. Erase those, and the outcome looks inevitable. Remember them, and it looks orchestrated. What's especially painful is that many of the people who offered help weren't seeking recognition. They weren't content creators. They weren't trying to insert themselves into the story. They simply saw a problem and believed they could help solve it. And being ignored didn't just waste their effort. It sent a message that help wasn't actually wanted. That realization broke trust in a way that still hasn't healed. Because once people believe that suffering is being preserved rather than relieved, everything changes. Sympathy turns into suspicion. Support turns into scrutiny. And the story stops being about helping a family and starts being about understanding why help was refused. At this point, it's impossible to separate the ignored offers from what happened next. They are part of the same chain. One decision led to another. One silence enabled another. And by the time the consequences became visible, the window for rebuilding had closed. Not because it was impossible, but because it was no longer useful. The real question now isn't whether rebuilding could have worked. It's why the idea was quietly buried before it ever had the chance. And until that question is answered honestly, the story will never truly be resolved. Comment below and share what you think. By the time people realized the door had quietly closed on rebuilding, the narrative had already hardened into something else entirely. What once sounded like delay now sounded like inevitability. What once felt temporary had become permanent. And the most unsettling part was how smoothly that transition happened, without a clear moment where anyone could point and say, this is when the choice was made. Because choices were made. Many of them. They just weren't announced. Instead, the public was guided away from practical solutions and toward emotional conclusions. The conversation was no longer about fixing a house. It was about accepting loss, accepting separation, accepting that some situations are just too broken to repair. That framing didn't happen by accident. It happened because it made everything that followed easier to justify. When rebuilding is on the table, people ask questions. When rebuilding is dismissed, people grieve and move on. And grief is quiet. Once the family was no longer together, rebuilding stopped being discussed at all. Not because it wasn't needed, but because it no longer fit the story. The house became irrelevant overnight. It wasn't evaluated. It wasn't secured. It wasn't preserved for a possible return. It was simply left behind, as if it had never mattered beyond its usefulness as an image. That silence around the house speaks louder than any explanation ever given. Because if the goal had truly been the family's long-term stability, the condition of their home would still matter. Even after separation. Especially after separation. A safe, repaired home would represent something to work toward. A future point of reunification. a reason to keep hope alive. Instead, the home faded from the conversation completely. That's not an oversight. That's abandonment. And abandonment always leaves a trail. People began to notice that the same urgency used to justify drastic actions was never applied to restoration. There was no push to prepare a safe place for reunification. No timeline offered. No benchmarks shared. Just a vague sense that things were being handled somewhere out of sight. Handled by whom? Decided by whom? And based on what criteria? Those questions remain unanswered because answering them would require revisiting earlier decisions. It would require acknowledging that help was available, that alternatives existed, that outcomes were shaped, not forced. And that kind of honesty would unravel the version of events that had already been accepted by many. There's a moment in stories like this where people stop asking what happened and start asking who benefited. It's an uncomfortable shift, but an inevitable one. Because when suffering could have been reduced, but wasn't, intention comes into question. Who benefited from keeping the house in disrepair? Who benefited from rejecting outside help? Who benefited from limiting transparency? It wasn't the family. The family lost their home, their routine, their unity, and their sense of control. They didn't gain safety in any meaningful, visible way. They didn't gain clarity. They didn't gain a path forward they could understand or participate in. What they gained was silence. And silence benefits those who already hold power. Another layer to this story is the way responsibility was quietly redistributed. Early on, responsibility appeared centralized. One person, one plan, one promise. But when that plan fell apart, responsibility dissolved. It became abstract. The situation, the system, the circumstances. When responsibility belongs to everyone, it belongs to no one. That diffusion allowed people to step back without answering for their roles. It allowed decision-makers to disappear into the background while outcomes unfolded. And it allowed the public to be told that what happened was unfortunate but unavoidable. Yet unavoidable is a word that only works if you erase the evidence of alternatives. And the alternatives were real. They came in the form of emails offering materials, messages offering labor, people offering coordination, professionals offering expertise. Those offers weren't imaginary. They weren't speculative. They existed in writing. They were visible, and they were ignored. The reason that matters now is because ignoring help doesn't just affect the present. It reshapes the future. Once help is rejected enough times, it stops coming. People learn that their efforts aren't welcome. They step back. They disengage. And then, when no one is left offering assistance, it becomes easier to say no one stepped up. That rewriting of history is subtle but powerful. It turns deliberate exclusion into apparent abandonment. It turns gatekeeping into isolation. It turns control into inevitability. And that is how narratives are protected. What remains unresolved is whether the family was ever truly consulted in these decisions. Not informed, consulted. There's a difference. Being told what's happening is not the same as being given a voice in what happens next. And throughout this entire process, the family's own agency appears to have been minimized. They didn't decline help publicly. They didn't reject rebuilding themselves. They didn't explain why offers weren't accepted. Those choices were made around them, not by them. That alone should trouble anyone who cares about ethical intervention. Because helping someone doesn't mean deciding for them. It means empowering them to decide. It means expanding options, not narrowing them. It means increasing transparency, not controlling information. What happened here looks like the opposite. As time goes on, the consequences of those early ignored offers become clearer. Not just materially, but psychologically. When people are told repeatedly that help is coming and it never arrives, hope erodes. When they're told something is being handled and nothing changes, trust breaks down. And when they're removed from their own home without seeing every possible alternative exhausted, trauma deepens. That trauma doesn't disappear just because the cameras move on. It stays with the people who lived through it. The most painful part of all of this may be the realization that rebuilding wasn't just about walls and floors. It was about dignity, about saying, your home matters, your life matters, you're worth the effort. By ignoring the offers to rebuild, that message was never delivered. Instead, the message that landed was this: your situation is easier to manage if it stays broken. And that is a devastating thing for any family to internalize. The story doesn't end neatly. It doesn't resolve with a single revelation or confession. It lingers in unanswered emails, in missed opportunities, in a house that could have been repaired but wasn't, and in the growing number of people who now understand that what they witnessed wasn't just a failure to act, but a series of choices made behind closed doors. Choices that shaped outcomes. Choices that redirected sympathy. Choices that prioritize control over care. Until those choices are acknowledged openly, the question will remain. Not just what really happened, but what could have happened if help had been allowed? That question matters because it challenges the finality of the narrative. It reminds us that outcomes are not destiny. They are constructed, and when constructed poorly, they deserve to be questioned. This story isn't just about ignored offers. It's about who gets to decide which solutions are acceptable and which are quietly discarded. It's about how easily good intentions can be sidelined when they interfere with power. And it's about how silence can be used to make harmful outcomes feel inevitable. The truth is still there, sitting in that space between what was promised and what was done. It's uncomfortable, it's unresolved, and it refuses to go away. And maybe that's the point. Comment below and share what you think. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.